Thank you, Frederic. Thank you very much for inviting us. There's also Adelina here in the crowd. So I'm going to present this paper, The Optimal Design of Green Securities. So we know that there has been an evolution in the corporate sustainable debt market over the last 10 years or so. We have mainly two broad categories of sustainable debt contracts, which are pictured here in green and red. The what we call the project-based debt contracts are which include the green bonds, the green loans, the social and the sustainability bonds, have the common feature that they constrain the issuer investment choices to specific projects that are targeted as green, social, or sustainable. So they have this use of proceeds principle. But then the payoff, so the interest rate on that contract is otherwise equivalent to conventional bond or loan, in the sense that there's no variation in the payoff depending on any quantifiable green benefit that the project delivers. Vice versa, we have recently seen the emergence of this what we call outcome-based contracts, which are the sustainability-linked loans and bonds in red. So those are the counterpart in a certain sense, because they don't constrain the issuer investment choices ex ante. So they are general purpose bonds or loan. But then they include in the payoff a contingency on the sustainable performance that the issuer has achieved, basically, with these proceeds. So to give you like a more concrete example, we have two contracts issued by EDF, a green bond in 2016, against a sustainability-linked bond issued by Enel in 2021. So EDF issues a bond for the construction of a wind farm in Belgium. Vice versa, Enel issues an SLB for the reduction of its own aggregate direct emissions. So at issuance, the main difference that EDF basically selects upfront this project, and which is usually verified to see that it aligns to a certain green taxonomy, and then it puts the proceeds from the bond in a dedicated account that can be verified. But then the bond coupon is basically flat. On the other hand, the outcome-based contract, at the issuance, there is a selection of a green outcome indicator, so non-standard financial outcomes, such as the direct emissions, overall direct emissions of the firm. The bond is a general purpose bond, so you can, in particular, you can potentially do multiple things with the proceeds. But then the bond coupon basically very exposed with as a function of the emission reduction performance of the firm. At maturity, in one case, there's an accounting matrix that is verified, which are this use of proceeds, whereas for the outcome-based contract, there is a reporting of this cumulative emission reduction, which gets usually audited. So the research question that we try to answer in this paper is why the market has started, basically, in this way, so why the market has started with green bonds, and why given that we see the emergence of this new contract that target carbon emission directly and are more flexible, so why do we still see a certain coexistence of these two categories with neither of those basically cannibalize each other? And we tried to answer these questions with a deeper one. So in particular, we ask ourselves how securities should be optimally designed if the purpose is that of financing, basically, of financing the provision of green outcomes, financing green investments. So we develop a theory of optimal security design for the provision of green outcomes. We believe that the important thing in this framework is to identify features of green outcomes. So we identify three features. First of all, green outcomes are uncertain. And more specifically, as we'll detail in the presentation, they have a great as is typical of sort of like long-dated investment projects, especially in this green transition phase, they have initially a great deal of uncertainty that can be resolved a little bit over time. And then, especially if you think about carbon emission reduction, which is the main interest here, there's not like a unique way of reducing emissions. You can do so by implementing what we call tangible projects, such as wind farms or solar panels. But you could also do this through effort-based or process or behavioral strategies, such as, I don't know, setting up like a measurement system to reduce your energy consumption, which is less irreversible, let's say. And then third, in general, we already talked about this in the previous discussions. We have this greenwashing problem in the sense that we currently lack a technology to measure these green outcomes, as well as other financial outcomes. So we embed these features into a contracting with moral hazard setup. So the investor has green preferences, the firm only cares about maximizing profits. The firm has the ability to deliver these green outcomes through a variety of strategies. Specifically, it can either implement tangible projects, but also adopt sort of like more effort-based behavioral strategies. And then, importantly, it can inflate whatever green performance it gets from these strategies throughout manipulation. The investor observes what's reported by the firm, but cannot disentangle all the factors. But importantly, it can physically verify if a tangible project has been implemented. So the results, so we have this, we believe, interesting result that the optimal contract nests the two categories of contract that are currently seen in the market. Specifically, we have two contracting dimensions here, which are outcomes and so this verifiable implementation of tangible projects. And we believe that in a world where there is manipulation, the optimal contract should embed contingencies on both those contracting dimensions. In particular, the outcome contingency is tuned so that to incentivize effort provision, but also taking account of the fact that there is manipulation, and the project contingency, so some sort of like reward for the mere implementation, for entering tangible projects, is necessary to correct for underinvestment that is generated as part of this manipulation presence. But I'll be more specific later on. The more severe is the level of greenwashing, the less you can rely on outcomes, and the more it's important to finance each project, basically, specifically. Which means that we actually, by moving a parameter on the model, which is this degree of manipulation friction, we get into the corner cases, which are the green bonds or the sustainability-linked bonds. So we get into contracts that are only relying on project or outcome contingencies. In particular, if manipulation is costless, we cannot observe outcomes, and you can only reward project implementation. Importantly, you can only do so ex ante, and so we are effectively in the case of green bonds. On the other hand, if you can perfectly contract on outcomes, then you should just do so and also achieve first best. So when carbon emissions are fully measurable, we should not see other type of securities other than securities linked to carbon emission performance of the firms. In practice, we do expect that there is a costly, like an intermediate amount of manipulation in the market, and so from our theoretical point of view, issuing SLBs and green bonds means substantially trading off two suboptimal contracts, and so the firm trade off the advantage of flexibility that have sustainably linked bonds with what we call a manipulation discount. And we do some very simple comparative studies in the paper, at the end of the paper, to try to rationalize the variation in issuance preferences across industries. And in particular, we construct a measurability index, as I will detail later on, using carbon emission data, and we show that, as we would expect, industries that have more measurable outcomes tend to rely more on bonds that are written on those outcomes. But then there is an outlier, which is this utility industry that issue a lot of green bonds, even though it is somehow good at measuring its emissions. And we believe that this is basically explained, taking count of a certain variation in how you can achieve carbon emission reduction. Okay, so I will be quick on the literature. We contribute to the literature on sustainable investing, and more on the side of how firms can be incentivized, to sort of like link to the previous discussions. The theoretical framework, we have like an extended multitasking problem in which basically we trade off effort provision and manipulation, but also the presence of uncertainty and the measurement friction. Okay, so the model setup, so we have an investor with green preferences, which employed a profit-motivated firm to produce a green outcome. In the model, the green outcome, as I said, is the sum of three components. It is basically the outcome that you get from implementing a tangible project. So X is a binary variable denoting the project implementation choice. And this outcome that you get is actually, sorry. Oops. No, okay, it's I'm clearly not able to do this. So, the outcome that you get is actually uncertain, and we put the uncertainty there to capture the fact that these technologies are usually like long-dated investments that are subject to a certain amount of uncertainty at the beginning, but then basically this project quality is realized at an interim date, and it is observed privately by the firm. On top of implementing tangible investment, the firm can also exert effort. So it can, for example, like being more mindful about its use of energy in the building, and then can also manipulate, so to like try to be more green than it actually is. So the investors will like observe all of this together, but cannot disentangle between the three components. So the investor derives utility from the actual green outcome, so the one from the tangible project and the one from effort exerted by the firm. The firm derives utility from the monetary transfer to the investor and then pays basically the project implementation effort and the social cost. So we assume here that implementing a tangible project involves mostly paying a fixed upfront cost, whereas this effort and manipulation strategies have a marginal cost. The contractible dimensions, as I was saying, are two. So the investor can observe the aggregate outcome, but also verify implementation of green projects. So if there was like a social planner acting on behalf of the firm and the investor, we would see that it's clearly optimal to wait and observe the quality of the technology before investing. So you want to retain a certain amount of flexibility ex ante in the contract, and then exert an amount of effort that is inversely proportional to the effort cost and zero manipulation. So that's sort of like the first best that we have in mind. And then we go into the contracting framework. So we appeal to the revelation principle, and we focus on incentive comparable direct mechanism, which basically take the shape of this contract. So what we have is that there's reporting of the state Z to the investor, and the parties commit to this verifiable project implementation decision, and then the investor recommends effort and distortion. Finally, there is a commitment on the payment schedule that depends on the reported states and the observable green outcome. So we studied a case where the firm makes a take it or leave it offer to the investor, meaning that the firm is equivalent to the firm maximizing surplus. And we try to derive this formally first in a relaxed setting where we take this revelation of Z as granted, and then we look for a contract that actually enforces the full set of incentive compatibility constraints. So the main first result of the paper is that the optimal contract includes basically the payment schedule of the optimal contract is a combination of the project contingency and the outcome contingency. So it is sensitive to outcomes to this extent beta, and beta, it's basically an optimal degree of sensitivity to the green outcome, which takes count of the fact that you want to incentivize effort, but there's also manipulation. So in this case, it's a standard multitasking problem. But then we also have a contingency on verifiable project implementation choices. And so the contract per se is basically a hybrid of what we see in the market, which are either green bonds that only have this delta reward, this component of reward for green project, and sustainability linked bonds. So what happens to the firm? If you remember, sort of like the first best, there was implementation of projects only if Z was above gamma, effort was 1 over theta, and 0 distortion. In the optimal contract, which is incentive compatible optimal contract, the firm exert a certain amount of effort A, which is lower than the first best, and a certain amount of distortion to this degree beta. The fact that outcomes cannot be disentangled among different strategies creates an incentive, in presence of manipulation, create an incentive to underinvest in the green technology. This is because the firm is only taking beta Z instead of Z for project implementation. And so to ensure that there's truthful revelation of the project quality and so an efficient project implementation, we basically need an extra term in the contract. So in practice, what does this mean? That the firm and the investor entered the contract. At some point throughout the lifetime of this usually long-dated contract, there is some quality revelation of tangible projects. So there's a discussion between the firm and the investor, and then ex post, there's a reporting of the aggregate outcome achieved, there's verification whether tangible projects have been implemented, and then there's a payment accordingly. So in practice, do we see these sort of like complex contracts? Not really. We have seen something that we report in the paper, but most of the times we sort of like see simpler version of this hybrid contract, which are, as I said, either you just verify the ex post performance or reward project implementation choices agreed ex ante. And how am with the time?
Well, we started late, so
okay.
I'll give you another 10 minutes.
10 minutes, great. So the good thing is that when we vary the main friction in the model, which is this manipulation friction, we basically degenerate into a sustainability linked bond and a green bond. Specifically, as I was saying, when the measurement of carbon emissions is perfect, so the distortion cost is very high, we should only have contracting basically on outcomes. So this beta tends to the first best benchmark, which is 1, and there's already incentives are already aligned there, so you don't need an extra reward for project implementation. So the sort of like the green premium that we are sort of like trying to look for in the market should basically not be there. On the other hand, when manipulation cost is very low, then you cannot rely on outcomes at all, which means that you really need to compensate the investor for entering this, this tangible project. Now, importantly, when you cannot rely on green outcomes at all, you cannot enforce a state-dependent commitment project implementation schedule. So you can really only commit on some agreed on some project implementation ex ante based on the expected amount of green benefit that a certain technology can deliver. And so we effectively get green bond and sustainability linked bonds as perfect as corner solutions of this contract. Now, as I was saying, what we expect is that there is an intermediate degree of manipulation in the market, meaning that these two categories of contracts are substantially both suboptimal. And so which one of the two is better to issue depends on some model parameters. So the sustainability linked bond contract in a context where there is manipulation differs from the first best in the sense that it retains the flexibility to invest in tangible projects ex post, and it has a good amount of effort in it, but also an excessive, inefficiently high level of distortion. Vice versa, the green bond contract, as an inefficient project choice, you basically have an opportunity cost of not learning more about the technology. You enter too early. And then you basically don't exploit those process-based or effort-based strategies to inflate your green performance because you don't have this pay-for-performance kind of contract. So in practice, in the paper, we can disentangle these the trade-off between green bonds and sustainability-linked bonds by adding and subtracting the optimal contract. So with respect to the optimal contract, the SLB has a flexibility benefit, but comes at the discount of the cost of too much distortion. So we have very simple comparative statics. This one, we talked about it a lot. So when the manipulation cost increases, you should basically rely more on sustainability-linked bonds. On the other hand, when the cost of implementing, everything is pretty intuitive here. So when the cost of implementing green technology, I don't know, setting up a solar panel is very high, you should go for a sustainability-linked bond because you want to, the value of the option to wait basically raises, and so you don't want to issue like a green bond and commit upfront to this investment. Vice versa, if you don't have a lot of, if your mix of strategies for delivering these green outcomes is mostly about implementing tangible projects rather than choosing more effort-based strategies, then you should again implement more green bonds. And finally, the more uncertainty you have about this green technology, the more you should implement sustainability-linked bonds. So I just wanted to say a bit more about this figure. Yes. So basically what we do, we try to construct a measurability index in the market. So first of all, we notice that most of the market is about green and not social and sustainable. And this accounts both for green bonds, but also for the metrics, target metrics into sustainability-linked bond contracts. So most of those are written on environmental outcomes and more specifically on carbon emissions. And then we try to construct a measure of measurability of carbon emissions using a granular carbon emission data from true cost. Here, there are other papers also claiming that the more, basically, the emissions that you produce from your own operations are more measurable and more controllable. Then there are emissions that you produce, indirect emissions that you produce through consumption of electricity, which are the scope 2 emissions that are less controllable and measurable to a lower degree. And then there are emissions that you produced very indirectly throughout, for example, consumer uses or investments that are very, very difficult to control. And so looking at the share of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions across industries, we basically want to see the extent to which this measurability relates to the issuance of green bonds versus sustainability-linked bonds. As I was saying, like we see that, as we would expect, the more measurable becomes the industry, the more you see sustainability-linked bonds, but utilities are an outlier, and we try to explain this in a very intuitive way because in our understanding of the industry, you get to the emission reduction here mostly to the a vast range of tangible project implementation, and we also actually try to microfound this, looking at firm disclosures of how they get to emission reduction strategies. So let me quickly sum up. The last thing is that as long as we see basically both of these two contrasts, we expect, if we take the model seriously, that manipulation is cheaper than an effort in reducing emissions. So summing up, we develop a theory of optimal security design for financing green investments in the presence of greenwashing. We try to embed 3 key features of this investment, which is uncertainty, manipulation, and different strategies to get to the green outcomes. We predict that the optimal contract is a hybrid that nests the 2 categories, and we make some effort in trying to explain the issuance patterns across industries. Okay, thank you.
Yes. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm super happy to commence this paper. I have to say I'm an empiricist, and that's as you can see, you could see that's a theoretical paper, but anyway, I enjoyed reading it, and in particular because it allowed me to understand what makes a difference between these 2 big categories of bonds that we can see all the time in the green bond literature, where you have the green bonds on one side, the sustainability-linked bonds on the other side. And the differences, I mean, it's always claimed that, you know, that's a completely different way of financing green projects, but the differences are not that clear, and I think in the paper it's very clear what makes this difference between these 2 categories of bonds and loans, and that's very interesting to understand the difference between these 2 categories and to put them together. Yes, it's moving. To put them together in the same framework to clarify the differences and show that actually you could have something like an hybrid contract where you're going to mix the characteristics of these 2 types of bonds and loans. So I think that's very cool to have such a paper to read. Probably the starting point is really this coexistence of the 2 categories of bonds, green bonds on one side and SLB on the other side, and in particular because you have, I mean, the market really started with green bonds, and for some time there were only green bonds on as a way of financing green projects, and then there was this shift progressively to sustainability bonds in the first place, and then sustainability-linked bonds, where it's a completely different type of bonds, but with these additional features that we didn't see in the green bonds. So this a shift from green to SLB bonds, so sustainability-linked bonds. I think that's really an important feature of the market, and being able to describe the differences between these 2 things. I think that was interesting. So the purpose is clearly to design a theory that would allow to build a contract where you could trade off these different patterns that we can see in the green and in the green bonds on the SLB, and in particular, I mean, the fact that you can on one side you can decide for a project, on the other side you have these outcome-based revenue and the uncertainty. I mean, so the manipulation story is that's an important part of the paper, and I think it deserves maybe some more explanation on this. So the key features are already here. So you have the substantial uncertainty on on how a green project works, and that's why we're always expecting some kind of manipulation or greenwashing. We don't really know how it's going to work. We don't really know if it's going to be successful. There are many different ways to build such projects. So it could be just building a wind turbine on one side, or let's say changing our business model, whatever it means. So you can design very different ways to say I'm going to be greener, and these different ways of describing what I'm going to implement or what I'm planning to implement is really different from an industry to the other. So this heterogeneity across industries, I think that's really key, and that's the purpose of these illustrations that was presented this morning. And I think that's really important to understand these differences across industries, because that's probably what drives the main driver for this a choice of green bonds versus SLB. So I'm not going to go too much into the details of the model. You have already had these details, so I don't want to take too much time on this. But I think the key point is really to be able to explain the differences between the two types of contracts and explain how we can mix these two types of contracts in one way. So here it's just a summary, but I'm not going to go through all the details, of course. But you have these two categories of bonds that we can see on the market, and really they are fundamentally different in the way they are working. And I think that's interesting to see and actually to understand why we have this coexistence of these two categories. And I think it was really clearly explained that we have different types of firms. We're going to have different types of projects. It's based on completely different purposes, and it's not, at the end of the day, it's not really a surprise that we add these two types of contracts, but of course it has some implications on. Clearly, I mean, the two categories of bonds have important implications in the pricing of these bonds, in the logic for firms to go for one bond instead of the other, and of course also thinking about what does it mean to manipulate in this context. So you have some room for manipulation, of course, yeah. I mean, I'm a bit. So let's say just one parenthesis. I'm a bit concerned about the way to interpret manipulation as greenwashing, and so I'm fine with 99.9% of the paper, and that's the only words that I'm a bit concerned about. I understand this logic of manipulation, that you could try to report that you do things better than you actually do. I'm not sure that's exactly what we understand with greenwashing. Greenwashing is I'm just misrepresenting things, and okay, I'm claiming I'm greener than I actually am. So, like in my annual report, I'm going to have nice pictures of everything is going to be green, and you can show photovoltaic panel everywhere, and actually you are just burning coal, right? So that's greenwashing. Here, the question is, can you cheat on on your emissions? So probably, 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was probably doable. Because there was no really disclosure. You didn't have companies or organizations like CDP collecting data on this. So it was relatively easy. Now I think it's going to be quite tricky and risky to do this. And if you cheat on your emissions, I think it's probably not a good idea. So I think the logic of the manipulation that you have in the paper is fine, but interpreting it as greenwashing, I think it's probably a bit stretchy. But anyway, it clearly explains the difference between the two categories of bonds. The optimal contract, I think that's this is a super good idea to think about this, and if we can see some combination of the two characteristics that we can see in green bonds and sustainability linked bonds, I think it's probably promising. We may see such a hybrid contract on the market at some point, combining these two types of outcome, one based on the project, the realization of the project, and the other based on the outcome, actual outcome. I think that's a good idea, and some companies may be interested in doing this just to prove that they're not going to cheat. And I think that's probably a way to be convincing. I just would like to take one let's say 2 or 3 minutes on this coexistence of green bonds and SLBs, and just go back to the picture Federica showed during her presentation. So it was a more complete, I just simplify it by just showing the measurability index on one side and the outcome base of the weight of SLB in the issuance. So we had this, kind of positive relation between measurability on one side and issuance of SLB. And I was interested in these 4 categories of industries, 4 industries, because they are very different. So they are kind of extreme in the plot, of course, but they have very different characteristics. And materials, this is the fine one in some sense. So, if you're in a cement company, you burn stone and you emit carbon, there's nothing you can say, and you're going to do it, and it's easy to measure. So I think it's very difficult to lie on the numbers. So it's clear that it's perfectly measurable, and we're going to have SLBs. So no doubt on this. For the financials, I think it's fine as well. I mean, financials are lying all the time, of course. I mean, they do everything clean, and actually they finance core companies. So that's precisely, the difficulty we have, because the easy number, scope 1 and 2, that's nothing. And most of the emissions associated with financials are scope 3 downstream, so which is, for the moment, almost impossible to compute. So cheating on scope 3 downstream, that's easy. That's why we have financials issuing only green bonds. But the 2 other industries are the interesting ones. And in the paper, there is a focus on the utilities, which I think is fine. And it's a bit a surprise that it's very measurable. I mean, that's easy to measure, how much of carbon you're going to issue to emit if you produce electricity with coal. So it's relatively easy, and it's not a surprise in some sense, but still it goes green bonds. Okay, so that's surprising. Energy, I'm also a bit. I have no explanation, and it's not completely clear in the logic of the paper why we're going to have hard to measure emissions for energy firms, and still essentially SLB. My interpretation is the reason why it's hard to measure, it's because there is a large fraction of scope 3 downstream emissions, and actually as a financer, I would not care about this. I'm not interested in energy firms promising me to reduce the scope 3 downstream emissions. It's not their business. I mean, it has nothing to do with what they do, right? So for energy firms, I think it's relatively easy to measure what they really do. Their scope 1 and 2 emissions. Scope 1 emissions of energy firms is relatively obvious, and I would probably push them a little bit to the right, and that would be probably easier to understand. So I just grouped. So these the 2 categories of industries, materials, and energy are really focusing on SLB, and I think there is a good reason why they do this. We know what they emit as carbon. So yeah, that was my question. What makes utilities and energy industries different? And I mean, for the moment, I don't have a theory for this, but it looks quite different. So to finish, I just would like to say a few words on the implications of this proposal of an hybrid contract. I think policy and regulation could play a role here, and quite obviously, the improvement in measurability is going to be key, and I have no doubt that it's going to improve over time. There is really a need for this, in particular Scope 3 downstream. I mean, many industries are, financials in particular, are not doing their job because of this uncertainty on Scope 3 downstream. So I think it's really, I mean, it's going forward quite obviously. And once we have some relatively good measures of these Scope 3 downstreams, Scope 3 downstream emissions, I think it's going to help quite clearly. So it's more like the disclosure question in terms of from a policy intervention or regulatory. That would be, to push in this direction, to improve disclosure of Scope 3 upstream and downstream emissions, and that would help. And of course, if we go that way, I mean, the measurability issue will be not that important that it used to be, and probably we're going to have this move toward SLB, so it's going to go that direction probably. But anyway, I think that's really interesting to have this logic of combining the two components. So I look forward to seeing the first bonds. You would have to find a name for these bonds. Okay, so that's it. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.